Actually, I didn't come from Detroit, Michigan. That's just where I was born. That would have been a long commute this morning. I love the previous speaker, and one of the pillars I think that the church stands on, and I think a lot of you guys would agree, especially if you've met converts, is the people who've converted to the faith. They're one of the people that keep energizing the faith. They're one of the keep spreading it and so forth. My wife is a convert. She was born and raised Baptist, and she needed a job when she was going to school at Catholic University of America. And of course, God was like, I tricked you, right? And she got a job through a friend working for the campus ministry of all places. And she goes, Father, he goes, yeah, I want to hire you. And she goes, Father, I'm not Catholic. He goes, you don't have to be Catholic to be my administrator. Just answer the phone and tap stuff out on the computer when I ask you. And she goes, that I can do. She started to become friends with all the students at Catholic U, but every day around 5 minutes to 12, they would all run out. And she was like, I guess they're just going to lunch. The next day, they're all leaving out the door. And finally, she says to one of the gals that she's real friendly with, she goes, where are you guys going? And she goes, we're going to Mass. And Alicia goes, you mean church? And yeah, and Alicia looks at the calendar, thinks to herself, it's Tuesday in the middle of July. She goes, why are you going to Mass on a Tuesday? And the girl says, the Eucharist. And Alicia goes, the Eucha what? That was the very first step in her conversion. It took another 2 years before she said the final amen to the faith, but that was the first thing that put her on that path, because she kept going, why would somebody go to Mass on a Tuesday in the middle of July for a piece of bread? And now she knows it's much more to it than that, right? Okay, so let's get into our conversation. In 2005, just prior to his death, John Paul II, he started it was an office of the laity, and it was called the Office of Church and Sport. It still exists today. And the whole purpose of this office was that he saw that there was sport in our culture, which is really important to a whole lot of people. And he's living, of course, in Rome, where soccer is really big, as you guys have probably heard. And he kept seeing all these people, even people of the faith, even his bishops and cardinals, and they're like, you guys are really crazy about this sport stuff. But he would take note that they would have a hard time transferring their faith to on the field or being a fan. So he created this office, and from that, literally, that's what motivated me to work with Ed on a regular basis on Carolina Catholic Radio to talk about faith and sport. In other words, it's a sports show, and my guess is some of you guys have heard this show. It's really a sports show, but we weave into there morality, character, and ethics as part of the conversation. So if you like sports and you're a Catholic, tune in on Mondays at 5 o'clock. Yeah, I think you'll get, if nothing else, you'll hear some really cool Benny Goodman music. All right, so let's get started in this conversation. All right, so this is just a little quote which I think is terrific. Sport enriches life. And anybody in here who likes sport, has played sport, is a fan of sport, knows that it does enrich your life. But it needs to be directed, right? And ultimately, God is involved. If God is involved here, God is involved out there. We can't compartmentalize him. And this is what the Pope wants us to do, and this is certainly part of our message at Faith in Sport. We want to connect the two on a regular basis. So let's talk about some ways in which it's so beautiful. Oh, this picture is a little smaller than I thought. All right, so this is one of the ways in which we know sport is beautiful. A guy flying through the air with a cape on to dunk, right? This is the dunk contest, Dwight Howard. But this is one of the ways in which it's beautiful, right? It's to our senses, and particularly our eyes. We see something happen, we go, that's pretty cool what they just did, right? A couple other examples. A great touchdown. One of the things I really appreciate, I played football in high school, but not really after that, but is the way these guys, especially in college and the pro level, they'll catch a ball that often comes at around 50, 60 miles an hour. They'll catch the ball with about a blade of grass to go, and both of their feet stay in bounds. And the referee will go, out of bounds. And then the guy that catches the ball goes, why don't you review that? Because I'm pretty sure I was one blade of grass in. And they'll review it. After further review, the catch was made. And the wide receiver's like, I told you so. I've been practicing that for several years. And one of the ways it's also beautiful is you don't see this very often, and it's what's called a bicycle kick in the game of soccer. It's almost a rarity, but it's an outstanding feat. And again, just kind of encapsulating the fact that this is a great way to spend our time. It really is. But it needs to be directed, and that's what our little chat's about. Let's talk a little bit about competition. It's good and it's natural. In fact, I would argue that it's necessary. But first, let's read what's here. Pope Francis said, sport is where we can experience the joy of competing to reach a goal together, participating in a team where success or defeat is shared and overcome. And of course, loss is part of it just as much as win. Well, if you're part of my high school baseball team, there's a lot more losses than wins. But you guys understand my point. And it's really good. In fact, I said a minute ago that it's necessary. In fact, if you and I were to play checkers, the most simplest game, or as my 6-year-old daughter likes to play, hooks and ladders or shoots and ladders. The cupcake game is another favorite of hers. But you have to try to win. Everybody in here knows this. Even if you're not an athlete, if you were not an athlete, you probably competed in something. I don't know, war with play cards? That was a bad analogy with things going on in Ukraine. But you guys know what I'm talking about. You need to try. Otherwise, it's not any good. In fact, it's just not fun. If I'm playing you in chess and you move out your king and I get you in like 3 moves, that wasn't very fun for either one of us. You have to try. So competition is good, and I'll argue every day that it's necessary. John Paul II, though, followed this conversation up, not literally, but in a figurative manner. Sport also runs the risk of degrading man if it's not based on and supported by the human virtues of loyalty, generosity, and respect of the game, as well as respect for the player. That makes the most sense. In fact, you are in a better place as an athlete. You are in a more virtuous spot as a coach, as an administrator, as a fan, if there's respect there. In fact, we would all agree that this is a virtue. Now, the interesting thing about this conversation is I'm going to point out some things, including what John Paul II says here, and that it's not always a good thing, even though the word itself, like loyalty, as we'll get to in a second, sounds like it's a good thing. But I'll bring up a specific case and make the point that it's not always a great thing. These little delays give us a chance to say the rosary, doesn't it? I don't remember I don't remember a thing this guy said, but I got through 3 rosaries. Okay, so we all play a role in this. If you're involved in sport, you're involved in one way or the other. We're going to focus on that last bullet point and that last picture. And we're going to come at it from a couple ways. If you're just a fan of sport, right, cheering for the team, but most likely, like these people are, they're cheering for somebody that they probably know, their son or their daughter, a niece, a nephew, a grandchild. But I'm going to zone in at least a few of my points on the picture on the right. How are we within the confines of our own home when we watch sport? By the way, about a third of you guys just went like this. Man, I think he's talking to me. I'm talking to me here. I'm a fan of all the Detroit teams. I'm a fan of the University of Michigan. Ohio State was particularly wonderful this year. That game, I loved it. And everybody knows what I'm talking about. So, let's get into this first word, this first virtue, what could be a virtue, but what I call a characteristic, and the one that was in that little comment by JP2. This is something when we hear, like I mentioned just a minute ago, that we tend to think of as good, right? We think he's a loyal worker. They were a loyal son. They were loyal. She is loyal. We use this term often when we're talking about a virtue. Let me give you an example of how it can be just the complete opposite. You probably don't recognize this picture, but you may recognize the story. Within the last 5 years, there was a high school game going on in the state of Texas. And the team that's on defense, the team that is to the left, and what is circled there is the referee who, as you guys probably know, referees, there's several of them on the field. One of them stands usually behind the linebackers, but in front of the defensive backs. This particular referee made a call against that harmed the team that is on defense, the team that is on the left, the team in the white jerseys. The two defensive backs are the players in this in more ways than one. The defensive coordinator for this high school football team, for the team on the left, pulled those two defensive backs over on a timeout right after this really egregious call was made on their team. And by the way, nobody's ever reported whether the call was good or bad. It doesn't matter. That's part of our conversation, right? And the defensive coordinator said to those two players, once this play begins, you hit with all your might that referee. And you can go to YouTube, and it'll be quite disturbing because one of them hits them after the other. They hit him. They're in much better shape than this referee. But the two things that made it worse is he did not see it coming, and they have helmets and pads on. And, of course, look at the word at the top of this picture. They were being loyal. They listened to what their coach said. And the bottom line here is you can be loyal to a bad cause. We see a lot of that in our culture. And when it comes to countries and communities and places of business, they are loyal, but it's not always a good thing. Case in point in sport. The thing about this is sometimes, even in the depths of our heart, we like this stuff to happen because we like retaliation, we lack forgiveness, we lack the virtue that God is asking us to have or to be when we're an administrator, a coach, an athlete, or a fan. And sometimes if we're in the same room with our son or our daughters or our wife or family friends, and we even hint that he had it coming type thing, then this is the whole reason why JP2 said we need to bring our faith into sport. They are not separate. Here's another one. Fairness, right? Everybody likes fair. You hear this word and you're like, yeah, fair. Let me give a couple examples here. This is a picture of a batter about to be hit. Happens all the time in baseball. Not necessarily right now, but it's going to happen hopefully in a couple weeks after the millionaires and the billionaires get done with their fighting. God's going to have something to say about that one, by the way. God's going to go, wait a minute, you got tens of millions, you got billions, and you guys were arguing over a couple bucks? And they both would be there and go, uh-huh. And God's going to go, you guys need to sit down. Let's have a chat. This is not just any picture, though. This is the final batter in a 9-inning game between the Washington Nationals and the Pittsburgh Pirates. This gentleman was the 27th batter in what was looking like a perfect game for Max Scherzer. He had gotten 26 players up, 26 players out, and for the 25th time in the history of baseball, and it hasn't been around for a couple years. It's been around almost for a couple centuries now. It would have been only the 25th time in the history of the game that somebody threw a perfect game. They didn't walk anybody, nobody got any hits, and there were no errors committed. But I happened to be sitting with some family friends And when this actually happened, and we're all at the edge of our seat. Max Scherzer used to play for the Detroit Tigers, so I was rooting for him in a certain way. And I go, I think we're going to see history here. And Scherzer had his cutting fastball, and it kind of came in on the batter. And of course, batters are not allowed to move into a pitch, but they do not have to move from a pitch. And he just kept his elbow there. He had a pad on. It hit him. He got walked. The perfect game was over. It's possible to still get a no-hitter at this point. But the very next batter that came up, a family friend, a big Nats fan, big athlete in his day, and very, let's say, passionate about sport, said, this next guy deserves to get hit in the head. And I just looked at him and I said, I understand what you're saying, but that's not a good thing. And of course, it doesn't matter what he says in that context. Max Scherzer can't hear him. The manager of the Nationals can't hear him. But the point is that was in his heart. And I remember after the game was over, I had a little talk with him about this. Of course, it fell on deaf ears because he was so frustrated. And I didn't lecture him. I just said, that's exactly what we don't want in our culture. Just because this guy walked, which was perfectly legal. And even if he did lean into the pitch and the umpire missed it, nobody deserves to get hit in the head. But in his mind, this was fairness, right? If you get hit by the pitch, you don't get out of the way of the pitch. The next guy gets to get hit in the head, and that's a retaliation of sort. That is fairness in this guy's mind. This other one's just as interesting. Okay, this is just a depiction to lead into a little story. Right? You guys know this. If you watch tennis, there are computers now, and then there's sensors on and they can determine whether the ball's in or out. And if the judge says that's in, he can say, can you check that? And they go to the screen, and they know that ball was actually in. And one of my students from Wingate University was the top tennis player. They were Division II, and they're one of the best teams in the nation at the time. And one time I was talking to her, and I said, I find one of the most interesting things about tennis is that it's self-called. And you guys know this, even in Division I tennis, there's only one umpire at the whole match. And so there literally could be 12 games going on, and all he does is roam from court to court. And the players themselves make the calls. And if you ever played tennis, you're running around, your head's spinning, the ball travels really, really fast, and sometimes you can't really tell whether the ball's in or out or it's close, but it's up to the person on the side of the court in which the ball falls to make the call. And I said, how do you deal with this? And she goes, very simple. And she almost got monotone, and she almost got robotic-like. And I said, how do you deal with this? And she said, if the other girl is calling a fair game, in other words, every time she hits the ball and it goes out, she goes, it's out, and she sees that it's in, the girl says, no, it's in, then she does the same for her opponent. But she says, if that other girl makes bad calls on me, I'll make bad calls on her. And I go, have you made some egregious bad calls? And she goes, oh yeah, I've called balls out that are 6, 8 inches in. And I just looked at her and she goes, that's fair. So that sounds, again, like something, the word itself, you just go, yeah, that sounds like something that would be along the lines of the spectrum of virtue. Fair. What's good for you is good for me. But that was a perfect example of, even though she knew the other girl was doing wrong, she decided to do wrong because in the spirit of the game, in the spirit of competition, I'm going to do what you do to me, even though it's wrong. I was going to say maybe wrong. It is wrong. Keep putting this in my pocket. Let's switch gears now and tell a couple stories about this. And by the way, in virtually all cases, this is virtuous. Let me give a couple examples on how this can be virtuous. This is a goalie who just had a ball go by him by his own player. He accidentally mishit the ball, and immediately afterwards, this is what happened. He took the guy, took the ball, put his arm around him, and he probably whispered something like, we're good. That is a form of forgiveness. This is what we want in sport. This is a great gesture. And forgiveness is not only in that confessional over there, it should loom all around and extend to sport. This is one of the greatest stories in the history of sport. Speaking of perfect games, you guys might remember this. In 2010, notice the big D. Guess what that stands for? I'll slip Detroit in anytime I can. Armando Galarraga. He's at the plate instead of his manager, Jim Leyland, giving the lineup card to the umpire, Jim Joyce. So what, right? You could say, so what? The day before this, in a game between the Tigers and the Mariners, Jim Joyce was the first base umpire. Armando Galarraga was pitching a perfect game. He had set down 26 batters in a row. He had one more batter to go at that time to become like the 23rd person in the history of the game to throw a perfect game. He gets the 27th batter, 2 outs in the 9th inning, to hit an easy ground ball to the first baseman. Did you guys know when the first baseman comes off the bag, the pitcher turns around, runs toward the bag, catches the ball from the first base, and he catches the ball, clearly steps on the base about a half a step before the runner hits the base. And Jim Joyce goes, safe. And this is exactly, you can look it up on YouTube. Armando Galarraga went like this. Stood there for a second, smiled, got the ball, and he goes, I got another batter to face. Never said anything, never did anything, was clearly frustrated in a really mild way. The game ended. He was asked about it. He just said that was the call. Of course, on SportsCenter that night, and every TV in the state of Michigan was replaying this, and it was crystal clear. Umpires rarely get such an egregious call, or make such a call that was so off. The next day, this picture was taken. He asked Jim Leyland, his manager, he goes, can I go give the lineup card to the home plate umpire? Jim Joyce happened, they rotate with each night, right? The umpires do. You go from home to third to first, and so forth. And he got rotated to home. He gave him the lineup card, and if I could blow this picture up, you would notice Jim Joyce is crying. And while he is crying, Armando Galarraga puts his hand on him and just pats him. Didn't say a word. That is forgiveness within sport. It's one of the greatest stories ever told, not just in baseball, which happens to be God's greatest gift to sport, but it is, I think, the greatest story, at least of forgiveness, that we know in sport. And to a degree, I'm hoping you guys are hearing that story for the first time. And by the way, all of that was true and none of it was exaggerated. It's a great story. This happened to involve my wonderful Detroit Lions, who, by the way, I don't think have won a game since 2010. So I should have a plate up here. You can make donations to all the Lions fans and culture just to make us feel a little better. I love when people go, Bengals stink, man. The Browns stink. And I go, the Detroit Lions have only won one playoff game since 1957. Look that one up on your little device called a phone. That's absolutely true. They've won one playoff game since 1957. Do I digress? Of course. I just want you guys to feel a little sorry for me. Again, I was thinking that the screen was going to be, what's happening here is the ball's in the end zone, and the Seattle Seahawks is pushing the ball out. You can't do that. You have to either try to contain the ball, fall on it. You can't push the ball out of bounds. The referee is standing right there, and he goes, yeah, that's legal, and they never reverse the call. And it was just a bad call against the Lions. I'm sure they would have lost the game anyway, but that didn't help. And as a fan of the Lions or whoever the bad calls against, and this is a great example, right? One of my biggest frustrations in all of sport is people said, oh, you know what? Now they're going to review everything. They're never going to get anything wrong. Let me wait for the laughter on that one. How many times I'm like, he didn't catch the ball. You could see it hit the ground. Troy Aikman will go, he didn't catch that ball. The ball hit the ground. Joe Buck will go, yeah, I think you're right there, partner. The ball hit the ground. After further review, the catch was made, first down. And you're like, oh my gosh, what are these people looking at? And we have to have forgiveness for them. They're going to make mistakes. It's quite possible you made a mistake at your work too, just yesterday. I'm not judging anybody, I'm just saying. And of course, when we're cheering in our homes, this is the way to demonstrate this virtue. These guys are going to make these mistakes all the time. Umpires, referees of all levels. And the funniest thing is my little son, Lukey, who I'm going to show you a picture of in a second, He's 10 years old. He plays Little League Baseball. And the umpire's back there. He's got his little mask on. And he's making awful calls, right? The ball goes over the guy's head, right? I mean, one time it went behind him, and he goes, just a little bit inside, right? And it was over the guy's head. Anyway, it's always good for the inning to end and put things in perspective. That umpire will take off his mask. He's 14 years old. And he's had about this much training to be an umpire. Just let him be. And of course, they give him as a hard time as they do as a Major League ballpark. And I'm like, let's forgive here. And we tend not to think of that. We tend not to think of forgiveness when we're being a fan. But it's a great way to extend that virtue, especially if you have your grandson there, a granddaughter there, your daughter, a friend in the neighborhood, whatever the case is. Watch how big this next picture is. Oh, man, if you guys know this story. 2016, that's my beloved Wolverines. They're 5 points ahead of the beloved Michigan State Spartans. They're both highly ranked. They're both in the top 15 at the time. They're both like 1 loss versus 8 wins. They're heading the right direction, both teams. There's about 10 seconds left in this game, and anybody, I should see a couple nods. You guys might remember what happens here. The punter gets the ball. All he has to do, they're ahead by 5. All he has to do is not only punt the ball, but if he gets the ball and fumbles it, all he has to do is drop on it. The game's over. And you guys, some of you guys I could see nodding, you knew what happened. He gets the ball, fumbles the ball, tries to pick it up again, and then for some reason that only God knows, he flipped the ball as if he had stock in Michigan State University. A Michigan State defensive back caught the ball and for the next 40 yards ran as fast as he could, wound up in the end zone. 113,000 people at Michigan Stadium were stunned into silence. Somehow, some way, they won this game. After the game, this punter in the University of Michigan literally forwarded a tweet that came out that said, the punter should go into the training room and drink as much chlorine as possible. Yeah, and so needless to say, the amount of forgiveness from that particular fan was very little. And that was tough to take. I looked at the screen, I think for about 14 or 15 minutes without blinking. I was like standing there. My daughter was like, what's wrong, Daddy? I'll explain when you get 20. Daddy, what's wrong? I'll be with you guys in a couple hours. I'm just staring at the screen. I was like, there's no way this happened. But you know the first thing I did? I mean this. And I'm always like, for lack of a better word, happy that I did it. My good friend, Scott Cesney, went to Michigan State University. He was the first person I called. And I go, if you're happy, brother, I'm happy. I didn't mean that. I said, was that unbelievable? And I remember I just said, brother, this is great for you. It's bad for Michigan fans, but good for you. And I was genuinely happy for him. He was so giddy. It was great. I love you. You don't even know me, and you can tell insincerity when you see it. There's a lot of ways that we show respect, or we can show respect, but unfortunately, one of the things that we see in sport a lot is disrespect. I played rugby for 15 years. One of the reasons I make funky comments, my wife all the time says, you have to go pick up Claire from practice in 2 minutes. And I'm like, yes, of course. And of course, I completely forgot. And whenever she goes, I just told you that 5 minutes ago. And I'll just point to my head and she goes, I know, you've been concussed 6 times. And it was terrible in rugby. I was the smallest guy on the field. I got crushed all the time. And this happens. And by the way, this is a little insight. You always know when a player is concussed when their elbows go into the air, when their elbows fold at a 90-degree angle. So whenever you see that, that's when they're knocked out. And you see this all the time. And needless to say, what this player did was he disrespected. It's one thing to hit him this way, but this is the greatest picture and the most evidential picture I can show you. Right? There's a lot of ways that we show disrespect to the player. This is a perfect one. And if we respect the player, if we respect our opponent, we respect the coach, we respect the umpire, the referee, we're moving our little needle further along that line of being virtuous. So, as we wrap up here, researchers have talked about what's known as character within sport. And there's what's called social character and then moral character. And what we're looking at here is all those things on the left, they can be either positive or negative. We can apply them in positive or negative ways. I gave you guys 2 examples. You guys can look up the rest on your own. Or get my book that comes out this summer on sport and virtue. Please, we just had our 5th kid. Please buy 4 or 5 editions. At least 2. And the ones on the right are, in virtually all cases, can be align themselves with a virtuous life within sport. The point here is the ones on the left can and are good when they're tempered by what you see on the right. Remember, this is just an introduction, so I'm only going to give you guys another 0.8 of a second to look at that. Look at those 2 monkeys. I have 5 kids. Little Jack is about to turn 1. That's my son Luke, who's 10. And this is truly what got me to fully come around to this. Luke has become a huge Michigan Wolverines fan, a huge Detroit Tiger fan, trying to keep him as far away from the Lions as possible. I want his life to be somewhat happy. But he watches with me all the time, and I've tempered all of it. Whereas I used to do stuff, well, we're in a church. I can't tell you how I used to react to bad fumbles by the University of Michigan. But now, I'm always conscious of him being there and the way he looks up to me. And that'll mellow you out in a minute and help put things in perspective. Because that's what this talk's about. And that's what the Office of Church and Sport is about. That's what our radio show at Faith and Sport is about, is to put things into perspective. Always remember perspective. Competition, it's fun, natural. We should see it as a privilege. And the question needs to be asked. My college coach in baseball asked me, he went challenged me with this. And he said, your issue, as well as a lot of athletes' issue, is when we win, we consider ourselves a winner. And of course, the opposite is true. When we lose, we consider ourselves a loser. And those are 2 separate issues, right? We all have the right to watch a game. We all have a right to go to a game. We even have the right to say something to the umpire. You're like, man, he's going to bring out the catechism. I like yelling at umpires. This is about responsibility and participation. Of course, it doesn't mention participating as a coach. This is just in general. This is 1914, by the way, in our catechism. Participation is achieved, first of all, by taking charge of the areas for which one assumes personal responsibility, by the care taken for the education of his family, by conscientious work and so forth, man participates in the good of others and of society. So in other words, you have the chance to be the moral agent. You have the chance to be the calming person in the situation where people are upset, either in the living room or at the field, at the coach, whatever the case is. We have the choice. We have the right to do a lot of stuff. But there's some responsibility that we have, and we are responsible as Christians above all. And of course, this is, if you read over the last 100 years, it's been about 100 years that our popes have made comments directly about sport and its purpose in our culture. And this is one of the things that they always come back to. You've been given a talented body. This is one of the ways that you glorify him, by going through the air for a header, by hitting a great home run in an important situation, whatever the case is. And I lead you to the Office of Church and Sport if you want to read more about that. It's for the office, it's for the Church of the Laity. In other words, it's for you and I. So all the words are easy to understand, and I don't think there's any Latin that's used, so you'll be able to understand every word. Ed, Jason, what time does the session go to? Right now. Okay. So if you guys have any comments or questions, I'll be in the back and final. Even though these are, I have a 3rd book coming out in Sport and Virtue. If you're interested in books that I've written about a body image, the one on the left is for young adults or teens, if they're struggling with body image or you want to keep their body image strong. And the one on the right is for parents, especially raising teenagers. They're in the back, and all I'm asking is, to cover the cost of the book, which is $10 in each case. And if you look at me and you say you're a Lions fan, I'll give you one for free. I thank you guys. You guys have a good rest of the conference. I'll hope to see you soon.